Imagine you are a, a ship captain in the ancient Mediterranean.
Mm.
You've just navigated weeks of these treacherous, totally unpredictable waters.
Right, your sails are wind-battered, your crew is completely exhausted.
Exactly. And you are finally pulling into the great port of Alexandria. I mean, it is a sensory overload of a harbor.
Oh, absolutely. It was this massive, chaotic intersection of the ancient world's trade routes.
Yeah, you'd hear the creaking of timber, shouted orders in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, just echoing across the docks. You hear the slap of water against the hulls of, like, hundreds of massive merchant vessels.
And as a captain, you are expecting the usual bureaucratic routine, right?
Right, you expect the harbor master's deputies to come aboard. They're looking to assess taxes on smuggled grain or imported wine, maybe some expensive dyed cloth.
But instead, a very different kind of boarding party marches up your gangplank.
Yeah, these are heavily armed officials, and they just bypass your cargo hold entirely. They're looking for something that the state considers far more valuable than your gold or your grain.
They are looking for your books.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. It remains one of the most audacious maritime reception routines in human history. By fiercely enforced Ptolemaic law, any scroll, any personal journal, basically any scrap of written knowledge found aboard a dock ship was immediately seized.
And the ship's captain had no say in the matter at all.
None. The state effectively treated knowledge as a highly regulated, highly sought-after import. It was subject to immediate confiscation.
The fascinating part of this policy, which I think the ancient sources usually call the Eek characteron, or the books of the ships, is the sheer arrogance of the follow-through.
Oh, the follow-through is the best part.
Right, because they don't just log your book and give it back to you. They take it ashore to the great Library of Alexandria, hand it over to a massive team of scribes, and meticulously copy it word for word.
And when they finish, they do not return your original.
No, they file your authentic scroll away on their own shelves, and they hand you back the freshly minted copy.
Yeah, you sail away with a replica, and the institution keeps the original. It was an incredibly aggressive collection methodology.
It sounds less like a utopian sharing of knowledge and more like a state-sponsored dragnet.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, if we look at it through a modern lens, it's akin to an internet search engine refusing to just index your website.
All right.
Instead, they legally confiscate your physical servers, lock them in their proprietary data center, and just hand you a printed screenshot as compensation.
Right, a printed screenshot. That is a massive, aggressive centralization of power.
It totally is.
But that centralization of power was the entire point. Controlling the definitive versions of Homeric epics, medical treatises, engineering manuals, it wasn't born out of purely altruistic intellectual curiosity.
Right. It wasn't just about loving books.
Exactly. It was a massive geopolitical flex by the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Greek-speaking kings ruling Egypt after Alexander the Great, they were signaling to the rest of the Mediterranean that they literally owned the world's memory.
And that geopolitical flex brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring the most legendary storehouse of knowledge in human history, the Library of Alexandria.
But more specifically, we are analyzing the anatomy of its demise.
Yes, because the story of how this staggering institution disappeared is something literally everyone assumes they know.
Ask anyone on the street, and you will get a very consistent, dramatic narrative. A single catastrophic fire, a clear villain.
A tragic afternoon where the accumulated wisdom of antiquity went up in a cinematic blaze of glory, right?
Yeah.
And then humanity was plunged into a dark age.
Right, that's the popular myth. But the actual historical records, the fragments and timelines left behind, they reveal a reality that is far slower, much stranger, and honestly, far more unsettling.
So today, we're going to unpack a 600-year timeline. We're looking at shifting imperial politics, multiple separate fires, confusing dual libraries, and a heavily repeated myth invented centuries after the fact.
It's a lot to cover.
It is, so let's unpack this. We need to start by understanding the sheer scale of the institution we are talking about, because the term library actually does a massive disservice to what the Ptolemies built.
It really does. Using the word library gives us this modern bias. We picture a silent building with bookshelves and reading rooms, maybe a librarian shushing you.
Yeah, very quiet and dusty.
But the Library of Alexandria grew out of and operated as an integrated part of the Mouseion.
The Mouseion, which was a massive research institution dedicated to the Muses.
Exactly. If you want an accurate modern equivalent, Picture a state-funded university like MIT or Oxford physically merged with the Library of Congress.
Wow.
And all of it operating under the unlimited financial patronage of an absolute monarch.
And the physical infrastructure required for that is just mind-boggling. I mean, they weren't just storing scrolls, they were actively creating knowledge.
Right, it was a living campus.
You have dining halls, botanical gardens, anatomical theaters for dissection, and astronomical observatories all in one place.
Because the stated ambition was to acquire, translate, and catalog a copy of every significant text in existence, they wanted every text by anyone, from anywhere.
It's an insane goal.
It is. And for a few extraordinary centuries, the gravity of that ambition successfully drew the brightest minds from across the known world right to Alexandria.
Now, the ancient sources claim the holdings range from tens of thousands to as many as 700,000 scrolls, right?
Yeah, they throw around some wild numbers. Modern historians treat those massive six-figure numbers with severe skepticism, though. Ancient writers frequently used massive numbers rhetorically rather than mathematically.
Kind of like saying, I have a million things to do today.
Exactly like that. But even if we assume a fraction of those estimates, it was, by a massive margin, the densest concentration of human knowledge ever assembled up to that point.
The density of that knowledge created an intellectual chain reaction. When you look at the scholars active in the Mouseion, it literally reads like a hall of fame of ancient genius.
It really does.
Take Eratosthenes, for example. He served as the head librarian, but he wasn't just managing the catalog. He was using the accumulated geographic data of the library to calculate the circumference of the Earth.
And the mechanism of how he achieved that calculation is a perfect testament to what the Mouseion enabled. Eratosthenes read a report in the library's archives that in the city of Syene, which is modern-day Aswan, far to the south of Alexandria, at the exact time of the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down to the bottom of a deep well.
Right, casting absolutely no shadow. The sun was directly overhead.
But he knew that on that exact same day, at that exact same time, an obelisk up in Alexandria did cast a shadow.
Which means the Earth can't be flat.
Precisely. By measuring the angle of the shadow cast in Alexandria, he determined it was roughly 7.2 degrees. Since 7.2 degrees is 1/50th of a 360-degree circle, Eratosthenes realized that the distance between Alexandria and Syene must be exactly 1/50th of the total circumference of the Earth.
That is just brilliant.
So he hired professional pacers called bemetists to measure the exact distance between the two cities by just walking it. He multiplied that distance by 50 and arrived at a calculation of the Earth's circumference that was astonishingly close to our modern satellite measurements.
He did that over 2,000 years ago using a stick, a well, and the data stored in the library. Just incredible.
And he wasn't alone. You have Euclid codifying the laws of geometry in that exact same environment.
Right. And you have Aristarchus of Samos using the sheer density of accumulated astronomical data to propose a heliocentric, a sun-centered model of the cosmos.
Yeah, he worked out the geometric parallax logic to argue the Earth orbits the sun 18 centuries before Nicholas Copernicus.
18 centuries. That kind of intellectual leap only becomes possible when you remove the friction of information gathering.
Exactly. When you put the brightest minds in the same room with the greatest collection of data, they stop spending years looking for a single manuscript and start spending their time synthesizing ideas.
And the Ptolemies poured vast sums of money into this. I mean, they aggressively outbid other kingdoms for rare texts.
They absolutely did.
I want to focus on that aggressive acquisition for a second. We mentioned the shipboardings earlier, but the Ptolemies went much further than that. There is that famous story of how they acquired the definitive original texts of the great Greek playwrights, right? Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides.
Oh, the Athens story. Yes.
So the originals were kept in the state archives in Athens, and the Ptolemies requested to borrow them just for copying.
But Athens, knowing exactly who they were dealing with, demanded a staggering deposit. They asked for 15 talents of silver.
Which is a massive economy-altering sum of money.
It was a fortune. They demanded it just to ensure the safe return of the scrolls. So the Ptolemies paid the deposit, took the scrolls to Alexandria, meticulously copied them.
And then simply kept the originals.
Yes, they cheerfully forfeited the massive fortune in silver, sent the copies back to Athens, and considered it money well spent to own the authentic artifacts.
It's just wild. That level of state-sponsored funding highlights the sheer expense of maintaining a massive physical archive in the ancient world. They weren't just buying books.
No, they had to maintain an army of scribes, translators, and grammarians. They were bankrolling the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint project, which supposedly involved 72 scholars.
The economic burden of this whole operation must have been
It
immense.
was, and that economic burden eventually sparked fierce international rivalries. The most notable was with the Library of Pergamum, located in modern-day Turkey.
Right, because the kings of Pergamum decided they wanted to build a library to rival Alexandria.
Exactly, and the Ptolemies, who were super protective of their intellectual monopoly, essentially weaponized their geography. Egypt controlled the world's supply of papyrus, the reed used to make paper.
So Alexandria placed a strict embargo on exporting papyrus to Pergamum.
They literally cut off the paper supply to freeze the competitor's data center.
That is ruthless.
It was. But necessity breeds innovation. Denied papyrus, the scholars in Pergamum refined a method of writing on treated animal skins. They perfected a material that became known as Charta Pergamana, which we know today as parchment.
That is a phenomenal unintended consequence. The Ptolemies try to crush a rival, and in doing so, they force the widespread adoption of a much more durable writing material.
A material that would eventually replace papyrus entirely in the Middle Ages.
But the vulnerability of that papyrus back in Alexandria brings us to the vulnerability of the entire institution. If you centralize all the servers in one building, like we discussed, you create a massive single point of failure.
You really do.
The intellectual gravity well of Alexandria was unparalleled, but it existed in a physically fragile state in a politically volatile city.
Which is exactly how we arrive at the year 48 BCE, and the most famous suspect in the historical lineup of the library's destruction, Julius Caesar.
The ultimate Roman boogeyman.
Yes. The dominant cultural narrative is that Julius Caesar shows up in Alexandria, gets into a battle, and recklessly burns down the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world.
But unpacking the tactical reality of that event paints a very different picture than the myth, doesn't it?
It does. The context here is the Alexandrian War. Julius Caesar has pursued his rival Pompey to Egypt, only to find himself embroiled in a bitter civil war between the young Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra.
Right, and Caesar famously sides with Cleopatra.
He does, taking up residence in the royal palace quarter of Alexandria. However, he severely miscalculates the geopolitical situation. He finds himself with a very small contingent of Roman troops, completely besieged inside the palace complex by the much larger Egyptian army of Ptolemy XIII.
And crucially, the Egyptian fleet is sitting right there in the Great Harbor.
Exactly. If the Egyptian army gains control of those ships, Caesar's Roman forces are entirely cut off from the sea. No reinforcements, no supplies, no escape.
So Caesar is forced to make a desperate tactical decision.
He is. To deny the enemy control of the fleet, he orders his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships anchored in the harbor. From a purely military standpoint, it was a necessary, calculated move that ultimately saved his life and his campaign.
But the physics of a burning wooden fleet in a crowded ancient harbor are completely uncontrollable.
Oh, entirely.
The winds coming off the Mediterranean are notoriously fierce.
Mm-hmm.
The fire jumps from the rigging of the ships to the docks, and from the docks into the city itself.
And the ancient sources, primarily writers like Plutarch, Seneca, and Aulus Gellius, they claim that the fire spread from the harbor and destroyed the library.
Plutarch, writing well over a century later, explicitly states that Caesar's fire destroyed the Great Library. It is a very tidy narrative, right? The brutal Roman general accidentally incinerates the beacon of Greek intellect.
Tidy, yes. But when we dive into the modern historical consensus, the picture gets incredibly murky. Because if you look at the actual urban layout of ancient Alexandria, the main Mouseion complex, the primary research institution, was situated somewhat further inland.
Right. It was deeply embedded within the heavily fortified palace quarter, well away from the immediate waterfront.
The geography is critical here. While the fire undoubtedly caused massive devastation, historians today largely agree that what burned in 48 BCE were extensive warehouses located right on the docks.
So not the main library.
No. Alexandria was a massive transit hub for books. The state was constantly seizing scrolls, purchasing massive collections, and holding them in portside storehouses, awaiting processing, translation, or transport.
So it wasn't the main library building itself going up in flames. It was the incoming staging area.
Yes, exact.
But even so, the loss of those warehouses would have been catastrophic. We're talking about tens of thousands of scrolls. It's sort of the equivalent of a massive Amazon distribution center burning down.
That's a good analogy.
It doesn't wipe out the whole company, but the immediate loss of inventory is staggering.
A staggering loss, absolutely. The philosopher Seneca, drawing on earlier sources, mentions that 40,000 books burned. Other sources claim higher numbers. But the crucial historiographical point is that the institution of the Mouseion survived.
The intellectual infrastructure did not cease to exist.
Not at all. And the transmission of this historical record is fascinating in itself. We rely heavily on writers like Plutarch for the narrative of Caesar burning the library. But Plutarch wasn't an eyewitness.
Right, he was born roughly a century after the fire.
Think about how hard it is to get the facts straight on a breaking news story today, even with video evidence. Now imagine trying to piece together a chaotic military siege 100 years after the fact.
It's incredibly difficult.
We see this phenomenon constantly in history. A catastrophic event occurs, and subsequent generations slowly amplify the damage in the telling. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing even later than Plutarch, explicitly states that it was storehouses of grain and books that burned, not the library proper.
And furthermore, we have hard historical evidence of scholars working, researching, and thriving at the Mouseion long after Julius Caesar left Egypt.
Exactly. You simply do not have a continuous, thriving academic community in the decades following 48 BCE if the foundational library they rely on has been reduced to ash.
There's also that story involving Mark Antony. Just a few years after Caesar's fire, Mark Antony supposedly gifts Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls looted from the Library of Pergamum to replenish the collections in Alexandria.
Which is a massive influx of books.
Right. If the main library had been utterly destroyed by Caesar, Antony wouldn't be sending a massive influx of replacement scrolls. There would be no infrastructure to receive them.
Exactly. The institution survived Caesar, it absorbed the damage and continued functioning. But the persistence of the Mouseion forces us to address the next major point of confusion.
Which is?
If Caesar only burned the dockside warehouses, why do so many later historical accounts describe the library being destroyed in a completely different century?
Yes. The answer lies in the fact that, as the centuries rolled on, the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a single monolithic entity anymore.
Right. The collection had simply grown too massive for one complex. The original Mouseion was overflowing. So the Ptolemaic kings established a second, distinct institution, a daughter library.
And this daughter library was housed within the Serapeum. Let's talk about the Serapeum, because understanding what this building actually was is vital to untangling the myths.
It really is.
The Serapeum wasn't just a quiet branch library in a suburb. It was a massive, imposing temple complex dedicated to the syncretic god, Serapis.
Serapis was a deity created by the Ptolemies to bridge Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. And this temple was located on a high hill in the Rhocotis district, completely dominating the city's skyline.
The architecture of these ancient temple complexes was expansive. They weren't just single buildings. They were vast, walled enclosures with colonnades, sanctuaries, and numerous subsidiary rooms.
And over time, a significant portion of the city's book collection was moved into the Serapeum. This served two purposes. It relieved the pressure on the overflowing Mouseion, and it provided a massive reference collection for the scholars and priests working within the temple precinct.
And potentially for the wider public in that district, right?
Yes, quite possibly.
So you have the original elite Mouseion down in the Palace Quarter, and you have this massive active daughter library up on the hill in the Serapeum. Fast forward a few centuries to the late Roman Empire, specifically the year 391 CE.
The geopolitical and religious landscape has completely shifted by then.
It has. The Roman Empire is now officially Christianized.
And that shift in imperial religion got profound consequences. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of sweeping decrees designed to eradicate pagan practices across the empire.
He ordered the closing of pagan temples, the cessation of sacrifices, and the dismantling of cult infrastructure.
And in Alexandria, this edict emboldened the local Christian leadership, specifically Bishop Theophilus. Alexandria in late antiquity was a powder keg of religious tension.
You had violent street clashes all the time between Christian, Jewish, and pagan factions.
So when the imperial decree came down from Theodosius, Bishop Theophilus weaponized it. The Serapeum, being the most prominent symbol of paganism in the city, became the primary target.
The pagan faction actually barricaded themselves inside the heavily fortified Serapeum, using it as a stronghold during the riots.
But eventually, the Christian forces, backed by imperial authority, stormed the complex. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE is a thoroughly documented, violent historical event.
The temple was systematically dismantled.
The massive cult statue of Serapis was chopped to pieces and burned. The shrine was leveled.
And this is the exact moment where the historical record gets grafted onto the myth. People look at the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE and conclude, that is when the Christians burned the Library of Alexandria.
Right, but we need to look extremely closely at what the primary sources actually say about the destruction of the books.
This is a fiercely debated area among historians, isn't it?
It is. The contemporary accounts of the Serapeum's destruction, written by historians like Rufinus and Socrates Scholasticus, they go into great detail about the smashing of idols, the dismantling of the architecture, and the eradication of the pagan cult.
But they are conspicuously silent on the destruction of a massive library of books.
Exactly. The silence is deafening. Which is strange because if a mob burns down hundreds of thousands of scrolls, you would expect a chronicler to mention it, either as a tragic loss or as a triumphant purging of pagan texts.
So what does that silence mean?
It strongly suggests that by 391 CE, the daughter library within the Serapeum may no longer have existed as a significant repository. Remember, the daughter library was established centuries earlier. Over the intervening hundreds of years, through various civil wars, economic downturns, and urban neglect, the book collection may have been relocated, degraded, or dispersed long before Bishop Theophilus ever stormed the gates.
So the raid was an attack on pagan religious infrastructure, not necessarily an attack on an active scriptorium.
Precisely.
It perfectly illustrates our tendency to compress history. People take a real event, the destruction of the Serapeum Temple, and lazily apply it to the myth of the Great Library burning, simply because both things happened in the same city.
It happens all the time in popular history.
It's as if 2,000 years from now, historians confuse the demolition of a local community center with the burning of the Library of Congress just because both were in Washington, D.C. We would call it terrible history.
We would. Yet, that is exactly what popular culture has done with the events of 391 CE. The human mind craves a definitive, dramatic ending.
We want a specific timestamp we can point to and say, that is when the knowledge died.
But if Julius Caesar only burned the dockside warehouses, and the Serapeum may have been largely devoid of its book collection by the time it was destroyed, we are left staring at a historical void. Who actually delivered the fatal blow?
And that void in the historical record was eagerly filled by the most repeated, the most dramatic, and undeniably the most fabricated villain in the entire narrative.
The story of the Arab conquest.
Yes. This is the narrative that you will find embedded in countless documentaries, articles, and casual historical debates. The story shifts to the year 642 CE. The armies of the expanding Islamic Caliphate, commanded by the general Ammar ibn al-Az, successfully conquer Egypt and take control of Alexandria.
And the myth unfolds like a cinematic set piece. The general enters this magnificent city, discovers a staggering repository of ancient books, and sends a letter back to his ruler, Caliph Omar, asking for instruction on what to do with this massive accumulation of knowledge.
The supposed response from Caliph Omar is one of the most chilling, perfectly structured sound bites in the history of anti-intellectualism.
It really is too perfect.
He allegedly replies with a strict binary ultimatum. He says, if these books agree with the Quran, they are redundant and you do not need them. If these books disagree with the Quran, they are dangerous, and you must destroy them.
And the narrative claims that, following this airtight destructive logic, the general orders the entire collection of the Library of Alexandria to be distributed among the 4,000 public bathhouses of the city.
The ancient scrolls are supposedly used as kindling to heat the bathwater, and the sheer volume of books is so massive that it takes 6 straight months to burn them all.
It is an incredibly vivid, horrifying image. The accumulated wisdom of antiquity literally going up in smoke just to warm the bathwater of a conquering army.
But when we apply rigorous historical methodology to this story, it completely disintegrates.
It does. The modern historical consensus is unified. This story is a total fabrication. It is a historiographical phantom.
So how do historians establish with such absolute certainty that a story repeated this frequently is entirely false?
We look at the transmission of the sources. The conquest of Alexandria occurred in 642 CE. If a cultural catastrophe of that magnitude had occurred, burning the greatest library in the world for 6 months, it would have left a massive footprint in the contemporary records.
Right. It would be documented by Byzantine historians mourning the loss.
Or by Coptic Christian scribes recording the trauma of the conquest. or even by early Islamic chroniclers boasting of the triumph over pagan knowledge.
But the contemporary record is completely silent.
Not a single source from the 7th century mentions it. The story doesn't appear in the 8th century. It doesn't appear in the 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th centuries.
Wow.
The very first time this detailed anecdote, complete with the perfectly structured quote from Caliph Omar and the detail about the bathhouses, appears in the historical record, is in the writings of a Syriac Orthodox bishop named Bar Hebrius.
And Bar Hebrius was writing in the 13th century.
He was writing roughly 600 years after the event he is claiming to describe with absolute authoritative detail.
The scale of that chronological gap is just staggering.
It's massive.
Let's put that 600-year gap into a modern context. It would be the equivalent of me sitting down at a laptop today in the 21st century and inventing a brand new, highly specific quote that Joan of Arc supposedly shouted during a battle in the 1420s.
Exactly.
I have no new documents, no contemporary evidence, just a story I wrote down. And despite the lack of evidence, everyone on Earth just accepts my newly invented quote as undeniable historical fact. It is absurd.
To understand why a story like that gets invented and why it successfully sticks, we have to look at the geopolitical context of the 13th century.
Right, Bar Hebrius was writing during the era of the Crusades.
Exactly. A period defined by intense systemic conflict between the Christian West and the Islamic East. There was a massive market for polemical literature, historical propaganda designed to paint the opposing side in the worst possible light.
The story of Caliph Omar burning the books perfectly serves that polemical agenda. It portrays the Islamic conquerors not as sophisticated administrators who actually preserve vast amounts of ancient Greek thought, which they absolutely did, but as anti-intellectual barbarians hostile to human knowledge.
It is a manufactured piece of historical character assassination that was incredibly successful.
It was wildly successful.
Yeah.
But there's a second chronological reality that makes the Caliph Omar myth not just unlikely, but physically impossible, right?
Yes. By the time the Arab armies arrived at the gates of Alexandria in 642 CE, the original Ptolemaic Library of Alexandria, the grand institution of Eratosthenes and Euclid, hadn't existed as a functioning entity for centuries.
The general Amr ibn al-As couldn't have burned the library because the library was already gone.
Exactly. The grand ambition of collecting every book in the world, the massive complex of the Mouseion, the army of scribes, that entire infrastructure had slowly evaporated long before the 7th century.
This brings us to the most unsettling part of our deep dive.
The real cause.
Yeah. If Julius Caesar's fire didn't end it, and the Christian destruction of the Serapeum didn't end it, and the Arab conquest is a fabricated myth, what actually killed the Library of Alexandria? Where did the hundreds of thousands of scrolls go?
The reality is completely devoid of cinematic drama. The true cause of the library's demise was institutional erosion. It was centuries of slow, agonizing, bureaucratic neglect.
The loss of the library wasn't a murder, it was starvation.
That's a perfect way to put it. To understand that starvation, we have to look at how the geopolitical center of gravity shifted. For 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty poured their immense wealth into Alexandria.
But in 30 BCE, after the death of Cleopatra, the Ptolemaic dynasty falls. Egypt is annexed and becomes merely a province of the Roman Empire.
And that political shift is the beginning of the end. The Mouseions no longer enjoyed the limitless, passionate patronage of kings residing in the very same city, whose personal prestige was tied to the size of the library.
Rome became the center of the intellectual universe. The emperors in Rome were funding their own massive architectural and intellectual projects.
So the budget for Alexandria was quietly, progressively slashed.
And when the imperial funding dries up, the entire mechanism of preservation collapses. You can no longer afford to send agents across the Mediterranean to outbid rivals for rare manuscripts.
More importantly, you can no longer afford the army of scribes required for the most crucial task of all, recopying.
This is where we have to discuss the physical mechanics of ancient information storage. The vast majority of the collection was written on papyrus.
Right. Papyrus is an incredible invention, but it is fundamentally a biological matrix. It is made by slicing the pith of the cypress papyrus plant into strips, laying them crosswise, and hammering them together until the plant's natural sap binds them into a sheet.
Because it is held together by organic sap, it is incredibly vulnerable. It is essentially a buffet for the natural world.
It really is. It is highly susceptible to humidity, which Alexandria, being a coastal city, has in abundance. The humidity breeds microfungi that actively consume the organic fibers.
and insects bore through the tightly rolled layers. The natural sap degrades, causing the sheets to become brittle and shatter when unrolled.
So a papyrus scroll in the ancient world was not a permanent object. It was a living organism that required constant feeding in the form of human labor.
To keep a text alive, a scribe had to physically unroll the degrading scroll and copy it onto a fresh piece of papyrus before the original rotted away entirely.
And if a text wasn't actively valued, if it wasn't continually copied, it simply turned to dust.
Without the massive state funding to pay for that endless cycle of transcription, the collection slowly ate itself. The less popular text decayed first, then the minor commentaries.
The sheer volume of the library shrank organically year after year, decade after decade. By the time Rome experienced the crisis of the 3rd century, the institution was a hollowed-out shadow of its former self.
And that century brought real physical devastation to compound the biological decay. In 272 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian led a brutal military campaign to retake Alexandria from the forces of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra.
The fighting during Aurelian's siege was intense, and it specifically ravaged the Mouseion, the royal palace quarter where the original Mouseion was located.
Ammianus Marcellinus, writing later, notes that the district was utterly destroyed and abandoned.
Historians widely agree that whatever fragmentary, decaying remnants of the original library still existed by 272 CE were likely pulverized in the urban warfare of that campaign.
So it wasn't a sudden, shocking loss of a vibrant institution. It was a final, brutal blow to a patient that had been on life support for centuries. The institution didn't fall. It slowly crumbled until there was nothing left to defend.
The history of Alexandria teaches us that the loss of knowledge is rarely a singular event. It is a process. It is a budget cut here, a shift in administrative priorities there, a failure to perform maintenance.
It happened so slowly that nobody living through it can quite identify when the point of no return was actually crossed.
Exactly. That reality forces a profound shift in how we view the survival of history.
We want a villain with a torch. We want to point at Julius Caesar or Bishop Theophilus or Caliph Omar and say, look at what those barbarians destroyed. It is deeply comforting to blame a catastrophic loss of knowledge on malicious outside actors.
Because the alternative, that the library died due to generations of administrators quietly cutting the preservation budget, is terrifying.
It implies that the greatest threat to accumulated human knowledge isn't violence. It's just us. It's our own societal apathy. It's our tendency to get distracted and fail to maintain the things our ancestors built.
Blaming a fire is easy. Taking responsibility for creating institutional neglect requires a level of self-reflection that societies are rarely comfortable with.
Which reveals a striking, almost poetic tragedy to this entire deep dive. The story of how the Library of Alexandria disappeared suffered the exact same fate as the fragile scrolls it once housed.
That's a great point.
The slow, complicated, messy truth of institutional neglect was abandoned. It required too much context, it was too nuanced to easily transmit. So society replaced the complex truth with whichever simple, fiery myth was easiest to remember and repeat at dinner parties. We prioritized the dramatic copy over the complex original.
Just like the scribes at the docks. We took the messy reality, locked it away in the dark, and sailed off with a simplified replica.
That is an incredible parallel, and it leads to a final, vital thought I want to leave you with today. We look back at the ancient world and think, well, their knowledge was written on rotting plants, of course it was vulnerable. But our knowledge is safe. Our knowledge is digital. We have uploaded the human experience to the cloud.
We use words like cloud because it sounds ethereal, permanent, and entirely detached from physical reality.
But the cloud is intensely physical. The cloud is millions of tangible servers sitting in massive concrete warehouses. Those servers require staggering, continuous infusions of capital.
They rely on incredibly fragile global supply chains for microchips. They demand massive amounts of electricity.
And they require constant, aggressive cooling systems just to prevent them from melting down. If a severe economic depression, a global conflict, or a massive energy crisis caused the funding for those server farms to dry up over the next century, what happens?
The cooling systems shut down, the drives degrade, the data corrupts. The modern equivalent of the papyrus rotting in the humidity.
Exactly. Without active, heavily funded maintenance, the digital world is arguably more fragile than the ancient one. What critical pieces of our era's collective memory are we quietly allowing to rot right now, simply because they aren't currently profitable to host?
We might be completely unaware that the slow, invisible fire of institutional neglect has already started burning through our own library.
Knowledge does not survive by default. It requires an active, conscious, and continuous commitment of resources to carry it from one generation to the next. It is a continuous act of human will. Keep questioning the tidiest historical stories you hear, because the truth is always messier, requires more context, and usually tells us far more about ourselves than we expect. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you next time.